I'm Ian Kerr. We're here at Postal Vision 2020 7.0. The theme of the conference is business not as usual. And when it comes to expressing an opinion on the Post, there's probably no one better known than my guest, Elmar Toime, as chairman of the Postea Group. But you've also got a great pedigree when it comes to the postal network. Your time at New Zealand Post.
Yes.
I say your time at New Zealand Post. We should clarify that you were the head of New Zealand Post
Yes.
there. And latterly as as deputy chairman at Royal Mail. And
Chairman of the Management Board.
Chairman of the Management Board, I beg your pardon. And you've been on the board at Deutsche Post
DHL, yeah.
Until just recently.
Yeah, until last year. So I was 10 years on that board.
So
I'm also on the board of Qatar Post.
Right.
And a couple other small companies.
A couple other small companies. All right. So now that we've established your credentials, let's get into some meaty topics, because you've just made a presentation here at the conference talking about rating postal operators, and I think you might have stirred up some opinions in there, which is good, because they're discussions I think that we need to have. You mentioned 5 benchmarks in there. Can you just run us through those benchmarks that you talked about when you're comparing postal operators country to country?
Yeah, I try and look at what are the conditions influencing the Post and what's the Post doing about it. So governance virtually defines civilization. Good governance means it's almost as important as good plumbing. And so how the board of a company interprets what the environment's doing, assesses the strategies the managers bring forward and so on, works with the various stakeholder groups and so on, not running the business, but providing that sort of interface, I think is terribly important. So governance, I think about, is the postal company a business? Is it a government department? Those are the sorts of extremes, if you like, that governance measures. The second is productivity. And, it's important, I think, at a national level. I think productivity is the most important measure in a country almost. And if you look at any sort of macroeconomic measures of how a company's going, they talk about productivity. And I think it's worth taking that down to the industry level and to our industry level and thinking about productivity change and how it's improving. In a time of decline and rationalisation, productivity can sound like a negative because it might mean costs, job losses and things like that. So on the positive side, I think about revenue growth and diversification and business opportunities. So that's a third measure I have which sort of counterbalances that sometimes a negative view of productivity might infer. Then I think about the regulatory environment. So what is allowed to do, what are the statutes and laws of a country allowing a postal business to do? That's such an important topic as well, and you might think the Post is unable to do anything about it. But the Post is able to show that it can work in the regulatory environment and at the same time present the arguments as to perhaps how it might evolve. So I think there's that sort of dimension as well. And then finally there's the commercial metrics. Okay, let's have a look at the P&L, let's have a look at the cash flow statement, and let's understand what the business is actually doing. So that's how I think about it, and I think it's relatively easy to rank companies numerically in that way.
And so if you want to be a high-performing Post, are these sort of the 5 categories that you need to be looking at from a very broad strategic level?
Yeah, I think so. To make it simple lunchtime speech, I think choosing 5 categories sort of, fits in with a 15-minute sort of talk. But yeah, I think, I've been involved in the postal businesses now for such a long time that I think about it in those contexts, I think, is that board doing its job, governance? What are the numbers telling us? What are the barriers to us, innovating, diversifying, growing, giving opportunity to our employees, so on and so forth?
We've seen some regulatory change in the Antipodes, if we can put things broadly like that. Let's start with New Zealand and the move from 5-day-a-week metro letter delivery to 3-day a week, and the recent news that it looks like that there might be changes to rural delivery there as well. What did you think of those changes? Were they overdue, or was it done at the right time? Because it seems to have been, from what I understand, it's gone reasonably well.
Yeah, I think the time was right. The core postal business of New Zealand Post was losing money, so it had to say, we can't be dependent on the bank forever.
Mm.
So we have to think about the next steps. And the beauty of New Zealand, I really can't emphasise this enough, is that the contract between the company and the government as the custodian of regulation, if you like, is in a deed of understanding. It's a document that says, Post, this is our agreement. You will have a certain number of post offices. You will deliver mail 6 days a week or whatever. There's a list of requirements. You will operate, and the law says you will operate as an equivalent private company. Once you have it articulated as clearly in a one-page, A4-page document, you can then start to draw attention to where things have changed that are influencing some of the other requirements that you have. And so I think the 3-day week has emerged as a statement of saying, in a year or two, people will not notice that the frequency of mail has reduced. And, there are already people now talking about 1 day a week delivery and so on and so forth. Not in New Zealand, but I mean, people thinking, where's this going to be in 10 years' time?
So it's a political process, though, to go through this regulatory change.
Yes.
If you're within a postal operator and you're a government-owned postal operator, presumably you're supposed to be apolitical or not making political statements. How can you influence political leaders who are subject to political cycle and electoral pressures, and no politician has ever won votes by saying, I want to close down post offices, et cetera, et cetera. How can you influence political thinking to affect regulatory change?
Well, I think, as back what I was saying before, it's about making the facts known, telling the story as it is. I can remember talking to a parliamentary committee myself once, and it was about this type of issue of frequency of mail delivery and performance. And I said, well, the consequences are, if we can't do this, the business won't meet its commercial targets. Okay, I said, then you, or the board, will fire me as the chief executive. You haven't delivered. I said, then the next year, you'll fire the board because they're not going to deliver, because this is what I'm telling you how it's working. In the third year, you'll accept. You're either going to pay the subsidy or you're going to change the environmental conditions. And, I think some openness about that and a genuine belief. Then secondly, I think you do have to lobby, You do have to know who are the key decision makers politically. What are the soft spots? Not soft spots, but what are the areas that they will respond to in terms of logical argument? And you have to keep that communication going. And I think, by the way, that's where the board of governors or board of directors comes in handy, is that the manager can look inwards and run the business and the company and tell the story, but the board can act as the political interface. They're the ones, if it's a government-owned business, they're the ones who've been appointed by the shareholder, and they're the ones whose jobs it is to tell the story. The consequences will be either you as the manager, you were wrong in your negative forecasts and then you pay the price, or ultimately you prove correct and hard political decisions have to be made. It's getting to that point, it is the hard part. It is a hard part. And it's not easy to stick your head above the parapet in a political environment. But I think if you're on a board, if you're chairman of the board, that's what you've taken on board to do.
The flip side of regulatory reform is often a subsidy. If we don't have reform of some description, there'll be a subsidy. It may be a direct subsidy or an indirect subsidy
Yes.
through no longer paying the postal operator no longer paying a dividend to the government,
Yes.
paying reduced
Yes.
taxes
Yes.
because the
Yes.
revenues are down.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on subsidies, and does the approach to a subsidy change country to country, jurisdiction to jurisdiction? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think politicians generally want to fudge the subsidy question because, as everybody knows, the minute it's a line item in a list of budget issues, the finance minister over there can focus on that line item. So the first thing is there's a whole set of fudging to sort of disguise where the subsidy happens. Again, it's a testament to the sort of quality of your accounting systems, actually, to at least present the information internally, and then how you internally use that information. So subsidies, exactly as you say, some are very clear. Post Office Limited in the UK receives a clear subsidy to run rural post offices.
Which is about to expire, is that right?
Well, yes, the government always says this is a 3-year subsidy and it's going to expire.
Right.
And the Post says, and it depends on how vigorous they are, say, okay, no problem. That means, 7,800 post offices will close. There's still agencies in shops, but no worries. So, what's your village, Minister? Oh, that village. Yes, that post office will close if you take that subsidy away. Now, that really shows some clarity on the Minister's focuses, the relevant committee, on the impact. So they will have to come to that point, and that point will come, maybe not this budget cycle, and it's not going to come in the next budget cycle in the US, but it's going to come in a budget cycle that say, we can't see how to keep these post offices going anymore, and the cost is this. We're not prepared to pay that anymore. And then it's deflected onto, it's a government decision, it's not a postal decision. The postal all you can say is this is the consequence. You either fund my profit shortfall, or we have to do these things which are unpalatable.
Changes to the universal service obligation are often sensitive, aren't they?
They are.
One of the ways that Posts have been trying to continue to deliver that USO is to a bit of cross-subsidisation,
Yes.
of course. So you've got parcels growing and letters declining.
Yes.
How about we somehow mix the two together, deliver them at the same time? Does this really mean, though, that as the CEO of Canada Post put it, the Post just becomes the deliverer of last resort instead of trying to properly compete in parcels? Does that influence the thinking there?
Yeah, I think so. That's a specific conclusion in both Canada and the United States, that they don't want the Post competing in new areas. So even in Canada, they didn't let the Post go into unaddressed circular delivery. In the US, only the Post can put stuff in the letterbox that you own, that you have nailed to your front gate and so on. We all know the sort of... That becomes a government call because they own the business. And so I think there is in the minds of some politicians that we will sponsor or subsidise the gradual decline of the Post, because the USO, I didn't say it today, but just to repeat it here, the new USO is universal access to information. It is far more important that you have a high-speed broadband than you get that mail delivery with the sort of frequency you currently expect. And so the question I pose is, how long will it take to get to that horizon where it shifts, where the importance of the Post has declined because the government has said, we don't want to see diversification, we don't want to see you doing new things, we're happy for you to be the deliverer of last resort, and when the last birthday card to the last grandmother is delivered, we're flicking the light. I said to this conference last year, think of this thought experiment. The government says, and it's only the President who can say this, says in 5 years' time, the postal service will close. Now, that's an awful story for an employee. That's sort of nightmare territory. But will the world stop operating in 5 years' time? You think of the potential of people coming out and they say, oh, I'll deliver your letter, you know. And quite frankly, if you give me $10, I'll deliver your letter anywhere in the US. There's no problem. You know, if you want it for 60 cents, well, that's another story. So it's not that mail won't be delivered or parcels won't be delivered. They will be delivered. They'll be at a different price structure, different service structure. Some people in remote communities will suffer, and the government and who looks after them will have to think about how to subsidise that. But the world wouldn't stop. So I think that's a way of categorising or thinking more deeply about, you know, the value of the postal service.
So it's almost a way of saying if we were to start from scratch and build a postal service from zero, we would perhaps look at delivery of letters, integration with parcels and all these other, and the location of post offices,
Yes.
the number of post offices,
Yeah.
all those sorts of things that characterise our physical network now. We look at it completely differently.
Yeah, I think so. You know, you look in Europe, click and collect, you know, every major parcel company has got a network of shops where they deliver parcels to. All the retailers are trying to switch you into click and collect at their store. Buy it online, go to the store, it'll be there next day. The parcel lockers and so on. So city solutions, I think, are in place, and it is difficult for a rural community. And you ask any, I think, if you were to ask any government, whether it was the Pakistan government we heard today or Royal Mail, what's your priority? Or ask what's your priority? Get a high-speed broadband connection into my village, or getting these letters 6 days a week. You know, the funding priority is going to go into that broadband network, and that's a statement of where we're heading to, I think.
Is it perhaps then that the USO with regard to post needs to change instead of just, and be separated along rural versus metro lines, or is it really just need to be rethought altogether?
You used the example of New Zealand before. And when they moved to a 3-day week, they were mandated to maintain 5 or 6 days for rural.
Yeah.
You've pointed out that's got to change. The reason for that is purely political.
The ministers are located in a rural area, isn't he?
Absolutely. And the government in power, the MPs, you know, all look after the rural areas. So it's a political question. They're saying we're not prepared to give that up. Eventually, the economic realities point the way. So there it was a difference, and it was, and it, you know, political makes it trivialise it, but I don't mean that. It's saying society values support for a rural community. Mm. This is how we'll pay for it. You know, there's a story of people living on the remote islands bought their potatoes and heavy-duty vegetables from a supermarket on the mainland, shipped through a subsidised parcel service paid for by the post. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it shouldn't be the postal manager having to decide that. The government should decide it. Yes, we're happy to pay air freight for potatoes to you because you're living in that remote community. So that's what I mean by clarity of subsidy and differentiating rural and urban and so on.
And I should declare at this point that I'm from Tasmania. And
well,
and that's straight away in Tasmania. For those of you who are outside of Australia, Tasmania is an island state, and there is the freight equalisation scheme in place. So there is already a subsidy outside of what the post office is doing just to get goods and services to an island state. Because if you chop it off, well, what happens to the overall economic development of that area? And there is a strong argument to be made that the post is critical to the continuing economic development of rural areas. Yes. So I know I'm supposed to be interviewing you, and I'm on my soapbox now about this is one of my soapbox because I'm from a country area, and I know what the importance of the post is, and that, you know, in some areas, people in Australia is a massive country, right? A massive country and very sparsely populated. And in some parts of Australia already we have 3-day-a-week delivery. And simply because it takes a long time to get to these places.
Yes.
and people adapt to that. Whereas in other areas, a 5-day-a-week parcel delivery is becoming important because of the growth of e-commerce.
Yes, yep. So just as in one breath New Zealand says 3-day delivery for mail, they're going to 6-7-day delivery for parcels, you know.
But you've got to get them out, otherwise they just build up in the parcel centres.
Well, no one will use your service if you don't get them delivered. So
exactly.
Yeah.
All right, we've been talking for ages, and I want to just quickly talk about one last little hobby horse of mine, which is postal banking.
Right.
And you're the man when it comes to Kiwi Bank. It's a very important business
Yes.
for New Zealand Post.
Yes.
Although they've sold off part of it.
Yes, yes.
And we hear continuing talk in various jurisdictions here in the US.
Yes.
There's continuing talk about setting up a
Yes.
postal bank.
Yes.
Is there a place for a new postal bank in this era, or has the age of the new postal bank, like Posta Italiana, Kiwi Bank and all of that, has the window of opportunity been missed for postal banking?
Right. The first question is, what is the status of banking and how well is it provided in the country right now? When I did that in New Zealand, the banks had started rationalising. They started introducing charges for ordinary transactions. So when I was talking to ordinary employees of New Zealand Post about that, they would say how awful banking was. The fees had gone up. They actually had turned to a cash society. Here I was just running purely on plastic, and people are running a cash society because of, so there was an environment. All the banks in New Zealand had been sold to Australian banks. So there was no national bank, and so there was an opportunity. If we turn to the US or the UK, these are very well banked countries. If we go to some developing economies where there is no banking, no financial services, one might argue the Post could start something. But even there, mobile technology has streamed right past that. You go to an immigrant worker in a country sending funds back home, the last place they want the funds to end up is in the post office in their home country. It is inefficient. It just doesn't work, and it's under government supervision. So the expert workers aren't even using money transfer in post offices. It's not, despite what we might have heard before, I don't think it's a big area. So if you've already established those financial services, they're doing well. So Postbank in Germany at the time was very, very successful, biggest retail bank. The Post sold it just before the crash, in a way, effectively. New Zealand Post has sold 48% of their bank, and it'll go, eventually it'll be privatised as well, I'm guessing. It's not part of the core activity. There are government services. We saw the story. What's happening in Liban Post is really benchmark activity, but they're doing it in an economy where civil services don't work particularly well. And so there, as a private company, have been able to introduce the standards of customer service and care and so on, that people know it's better to go to one of their offices or mobile locations. So I really think it depends on the country in particular. And so if you wanted to name a country, I'd give you an opinion about it. But I think it's a marketing question, not here's a hope for the Post or the Post Office.
That's another guaranteed licence to print money. It has to be proper market research done before any steps should be made down the path to a post bank.
Yes, what's the need? Not your need as a post office, but what's the market need out there for another sort of bank? So if banks were ripping off and cooperatives still exist, for example, I often thought one idea would be to try and coordinate cooperatives that operate typically in regional communities, cooperative banks, and bring them together under a sort of national umbrella. And that's why Italian Post was so successful, is there was no national bank. It was all, the bank of this region, the bank of that region, and so on. And so they became a national player. Portugal has just started the banking operations. I think they're going to be very successful. So it's working in some places. But in a well-banked country, I don't think it's going to work.
That was one of the critical points of success for the Poste Italiane Bank as well, was the government moved from physical payments to direct deposits into people's bank accounts. So they capitalised on that opportunity. So there was that matter of timing as well. Which was
no, exactly. It was a matter of timing. It got in there, and ultimately all their money is not from banking; it's from insurance services.
Poste Italiane is a financial company that does a bit of letter delivering on the side. And
now they're saying, the new management and so on are saying, well, we ought to be better parcel operators. So I'm thinking to myself, what's driving that conversation? Why are they saying we now need to do more in logistics unless, well, I don't know.
Interesting question, and probably one we'd have to discuss another time. I think we've run way over time.
It's been a great pleasure talking
Elmar
to you.
Toime, thanks very much for joining us today.
No, it's been great. Thank you.